Hi everyone, my name is Diogo Ribeiro. I come from Portugal. I did my bachelor's and my master's in the University of Lisbon. And I came to Canada to do my PhD under the supervision of Bertrand Rotier and Georges Baudouin. You may have noticed that the talks changed. I was supposed to go first, but it makes more sense for me to go last because I'm working both in the Poniac and the Quetico provinces. So now you have the tectonic metamorphic context, and I can proceed for this talk. So basically, I will address the metal and ligand mobility during the prograde metamorphism of these belts, and what are the implications for gold endowment. So a lot of different sources have been proposed for orogenic gold deposits, like fluids coming from the mantle, related to magmatism, but it's generally agreed upon that the fluids are related mostly to the devolatilization of crustal rocks. And the devolatilization model predicts that at the transition from green schist to amphibolite facies, you will have a great release of fluids due to the breakdown of hydrous facies, like chloride. But it's also been predicted that pyrite may break down around the same time. So you would have a breakdown from pyrite to pyritite, which theoretically releases sulfur. And this would occur around the same time as the chloride breakdown. So you would release not only just fluid, but also sulfur. And if that pyrite is gold bearing, you would release gold as well. It is generally accepted that the source for orogenic gold deposits in the Phanerozoic are metasedimentary rocks in the general. It's been proven by mainly Pitcairn. He has quite a lot of studies on it. And what it shows is that there's a consistent loss of gold, arsenic, and antimony from metasedimentary rocks as they're being metamorphosed. But in the greenstone belts, the metasedimentary rocks have been generally overlooked just because they're not very abundant. However, in the superior province, we have metasedimentary belts. They are often adjacent and overtrussed by greenstone belts that are endowed. So these metasedimentary belts are much more metamorphosed than the greenstones are. So they were dehydrated, much more dehydrated and devolatilized than the greenstones. And since they're underneath them, that raises the question whether they were a suitable source for of metals and ligands to these greenstone belts. So what I'm going to do is track the element mobility in these metasedimentary belts during prograde metamorphism. It has been, in 2021, Pitcairn and others published this paper. In the Poniac metasediments, they collected rocks in Rouyn-Noranda and Val d'Or areas, and they did ultra-low detection limit analysis for trace elements, including gold, and the results were this. So a systematic decrease of gold content and arsenic and antimony as the metamorphic rate increases. And this suggests that these elements were mobilized during prograde metamorphism. However, they're still missing the constraint of the PT conditions, and where are the key metamorphic reactions releasing these elements. And they haven't tracked the element mobility at the mineral scale. So what I'm going to do is do whole rock geochemistry, and then also ultra-low detection limit analysis for gold, and combine that with in situ analysis in prograde metamorphic minerals. And this information will be combined with the PT constraints coming from Isaac and Adrian from both the Poniac and the Quetico. And the ultimate goal is to find the optimal PT conditions for the release of gold-bearing fluids, thus the name of the project, Gold Fluid Window. So I will compare 3 different transects spread out on the two metasedimentary belts. The first one is Juanoranda, which is the endowed sector. The classification of endowed, moderately endowed, and barren is based on the amount of mining projects, old or current, that are present adjacent to, in the greenstone belts adjacent to these areas. So we have Juanoranda, which is the endowed area, adjacent to the Abitibi gold camp. The moderately endowed area, which is Geraldton, adjacent to the Bearmore-Geraldton belt. And the barren area is Thunder Bay, which has no known gold, orogenic gold occurrences. So I did some sampling. This is an example from Geraldton. And the goal of the sampling was to get as much spatial and protholith representativity and sample across all the metamorphic zones. So I got mainly metasedimentary rocks from greywacke to peelite and subordinate mafic volcanic rocks from lava flows to volcaniclastics. This totalized a total of 271 samples, from which I selected 143 for the trace elements and gold analyses. So regarding the gold analyses, in their work, Pitcairn usually uses a method that he developed himself, which involves a lot of acid digestion and then chromatographic separation and then ICP-MS. This takes quite a lot of time, and it's quite dangerous. So we decided to try a new method, which is doing laser ablation on pressed powder pellets. The powders are not normal milled rocks. After the rock is milled, it's nano-milled, so that when we perform laser ablation on the pellets, we avoid nugget effects. And they basically have the same detection limits, ranging, they can go for PPTs. So since we are working with such low concentrations of gold, contamination is a big part of it, so I try to avoid as much contact with metal. So after I cut the samples, I grind the surface that was in contact with the blade with a grinding wheel, 98% aluminum oxide. And then afterwards, I crush them by hand. So just a hammer and lots of plastic and paper. If mental sanity is something important to you, don't do this, okay? And then they were milled, and they were shipped to Germany, where I was from January to March in 2022, working with Clifford Patton and Johan Kolb at the kit. And this was the nanomilling, so the powder is milled again in water, in small agate vials, and then the sample is dried and rehomogenized, and then it's pressed into into pellets. So you can see here the difference between not nanomilled powder and a nanomilled one. So it's quite a lot of difference, and that's why we are able to avoid nugget effects in our analysis. And then we performed about 5 spots per pellet to make sure that they were homogeneous, and with the spot size of 150 micron and a frequency of 100 hertz. So on to the results. First, the whole rock geochemistry. So I have here divided the 2 subprovinces, Juanoranda, the endowed one, Geraldton, the moderately endowed, and Thunder Bay, the barren one. So the circles, the gray circles are metasedimentary rocks, and the green diamonds are mafic rocks. And the gray lines and the green lines connect the average concentrations for the metasedimentary and the volcanic rocks, respectively. And you can see here, for the Quetico subprovince, it ranges from chlorite zone to the melt zone, and then in Juanoranda, it ranges from the biotite to the sillimanite zone. And what we can see is that they have, at low grade, they have about the same concentration of arsenic and antimony, and there's a systematic decrease of concentration of both elements in all the areas with increasing metamorphic grade, suggesting that these elements were mobilized during prograde metamorphism. But when we look at gold, we don't see the same. What we see is that even though they have the same concentrations at low grade, the decreasing trends are only observed in the endowed areas. If we come here to the barren one, we see that the median values in each metamorphic zone is basically constant. So for some reason, gold was mobilized in the endowed areas, but not in the barren one. And when we look at water and ligands, we see that there's a decrease of the water content in all of the areas, which was expected. The rocks are being dehydrated. However, there's no systematic decrease of either sulfur or chlorine. So, yeah. When we look at low-grade metasedimentary rock, this is generally their mineralogy, and we want to know where the gold is hosted and which minerals. So the first idea was, well, maybe oxides, sulfides almost for sure, and maybe titanite. So I performed laser ablation in all of them, and we found basically just gold contents in the sulfides, as we expected. So I did this only in the Geraldton area, which is the moderately endowed area, and now I'm going to explain to you the textures that I've seen, the different sulfides, and then show you the concentration values for those. So this diagram shows you the increase of metamorphic rate towards the right, and these shapes tell you where the mineral is present. So we're going to start with pyrite 1, and this means that pyrite is present from chlorite to the staurolite zone, and the width of these shapes regards its abundance. So it's more abundant in the chlorite zone. The pyrite one usually has subhedral cores that are inclusion pore and then overgrowth with rims that are filled with inclusions. And the pyrite tends to lose its inclusions as it progresses to, as it's found in higher metamorphic grades, such as the garnet and the staurolite zone. Then we start to get transitional phases. So what usually we can see is that there's a linear textural replacement of pyrite 1, and then pyritite starts to appear afterwards. I will explain this further on. And then following that, there's pyrite. Pyrite becomes stable, and usually it has exhalations of pentlandite flames. After this, there's another transition towards another generation of pyrites. So we start to grow euhedral pyrite grains inside the pyritite, and they grow so much that eventually they consume the pyrite itself. And at some point in the melt zone, the sulfides are completely washed out from the rock, remaining only preserved inside porphyroblasts. So if we look at the first transition, the pyrite to pyritite, what we can see is that these transition phases, they have a banded texture. They seem to have a pyrite and pyritite-like compositions. They seem to be like a kind of an interlaying, and the bands are quite thin in the beginning, but they tend to become more massive and more homogeneous and thicker towards higher grades. And usually there's these elements, like here, they're always present, sometimes they're present, and their composition is something in between a pentlandite and a pyritite. There's also here a bit of that. And here at higher grade, they seem to start to develop the flames that we see in pyritite. And here the composition of these elements are closer to pentlandites. So when we do the chemistry, EPMA chemistry of these phases, we can see that they have the composition in between pyrite and pyritite, and the elements I just talked about now are in between pentlandite and pyrrhotite. So we do have a transition from pyrite to pyrrhotite, and theoretically we should be releasing sulfur. But we don't see that in the whole rock data. So this may suggest that once the sulfur is released by the breakdown of pyrite, it may react immediately with iron released from the breakdown of other phases like chloride, which can be present until maybe garnet zone, not more than that. So that would explain it. So now we're gonna look at the concentrations, gold, arsenic, and antimony concentrations of these sulfides. So these are box plots. When I didn't have for each metamorphic zone, when I didn't have enough analyses to build a box plot, I just plotted them here. The color scheme is explained here: yellow for pyrite 1, orange for transition, brown for pyrrhotite, and greenish for pyrite 2. And starting with pyrite 1, it does seem that this is the sulfide with the highest concentrations, and the medium concentrations tend to decrease with increasing metamorphic grade within pyrite 1. Then if we look at the transitions, they tend to have, within this each metamorphic zone, they tend to have a concentration in between pyrite and pyrrhotite, meaning that they are actually the transition between the two of them. And pyrrhotite has much lower concentration values. It also shows a decrease, a gradual decrease of concentrations with increasing metamorphic grade. However, the magnitude of these values are much lower than pyrite, so I don't believe it's releasing a significant amount of these elements. And then we transition to pyrite 2. There's a slight increase generally in all of the elements when we transition from one to the other, but it seems just a reconcentration of these elements, and as the concentrations are pretty low also, it shouldn't be too important for the mobility of these elements. So we did track the element mobility, the metal mobility at the basin and mineral scale, and compared sectors with different endowments. And the whole rock data showed us that even though at low grades the metasedimentary rocks have similar concentration values, and that arsenic was released in all of the area, arsenic and antimony was released in all of the areas, gold was not mobilized in the barren area. So this suggests that there is a spatial correlation between gold mobilization in the metasedimentary belts and the gold endowment in the adjacent greenstone belts. And regarding the sulfides in the Gibraltar transect, there's two transitions, gradual, very continuous, one from pyrite to pyrrhotite and then pyrrhotite to pyrite. And the transition from pyrite to pyrrhotite, has it been suggested in a lot of studies, may be the major reaction controlling the release of these elements. However, the recrystallization of pyrite may also be important may also contribute with important volumes. So in conclusion, it does seem that the devolatilization of metasedimentary belts has sourced arsenic, gold, and antimony to the orogenic gold deposits in the overlying greenstone belts. And it may be a factor controlling gold endowment. So the next steps will be to apply the same methodology we did for the Gibraltar transect in the Rouyn-Noranda and Thunder Bay areas and see what's different. Thank you.